Good morning and greetings from the city of Tangier, where we are hosting the first live session on the sidelines of the CyFy Africa conference. These live sessions, by way of introduction, these sessions are meant to be brief exchanges with some of our speakers and participants who have very kindly agreed to spend some time with us and have an informal exchange of ideas and arguments on some of the issues that we have not been able to cover that we will not be able to cover in the next 2 days. So joining me for the first live session of this conference today, and we'll have many more of these over the course of the next 48 hours, is a group of very widely regarded scholars, thinkers, uh, and knowledgeable experts are very who come from various backgrounds, who are um, perhaps some of the most who hail from backgrounds and from institutions who are perhaps the most equipped to talk about a very sensitive and rather controversial topic that is the subject of the live session, which is the world heading towards a splinternet? And the notion of a splinternet has changed over the last few years. Initially, it used to in the days of the INR transition and questions regarding the governance of the domain name system, the splinternet used to denote attempts by actors to create a separate internet, a separate technical infrastructure for an internet. But I think that question has absorbed economic dimensions over the course of the last few years and come to embrace a rather contentious political, economic, and still technical debate about what it means to have different internets, whether they are geographically or spatially located, or whether they are disaggregated by communities. Are different communities subscribing or taking advantage of different kinds of internets? So to talk about the many dimensions of this topic, we have, like I said, people who are very competent to talk about it, not just from their own personal expertise, but also by virtue of the institutions they represent. Let me first go to Wang Dong, who is an associate professor at Peking University. Wang, I'm going to ask you this as a scholar who's based out of China, and China. So, if you to take back the debate on the technical dimensions it had assumed in 2013, 14, during the days of the INR transition. At that point, you could see voices coming out of China saying, of course, you need to have a separate regime for the management of the DNS, and if China's and other developing countries' concerns are not equitably represented, then we should have a separate domain name system altogether. But that view has receded because in the last 5 years, China has become such a major player in the global digital economy that many people in China, I believe you as well, believe that it is in the interest of China to have an open and affordable internet in which the Chinese are among the many players who have a significant economic stake. At the same time, the Chinese digital economy is unique and has very few comparisons with the rest of the world. How are you managing this tension between the fact that Chinese companies today want to go out and do business with the rest of the world and want to keep the internet open for their own commercial considerations, and the fact that the Chinese internet, for lack of a better word, is still somewhat restrictive, or perhaps is somewhat unique in the fact that it is insulated from the rest of the world compared to other developing economies?
Thank you very much for this question. I think what you notice is what we have witnessed is, I think, in the past few years, decades. Really, I think the development of internet has really symbolized the trend of globalization in the post-Cold War world. And you are also right. I think in the past few years, there has been growing differences between developing countries such as China, Russia to some extent, India as well, and vis-a-vis the Western countries regarding the cyber governance. So I think the question you posed, my understanding actually goes to this broader issue of cyber governance, whether we should be adopting, so to speak, a Western model of cyber governance, or we should allow more sort of respect of the different domestic situations, sovereignties, etc., of various different developing countries. I think, to be very honest, I think the West used to have a very dominant view in that regard, and sort of unified, sort of end of history, right? Everything should move toward the same direction. And anyone goes sort of, does not follow that, they will feel like, oh, you're not following the direction of history. I think that is too, I think, arbitrary, too kind of arrogant. I think it is also, make no mistake, I think China also advocate open internet, but it just with condition that the cyber governance, it has to really be in accordance with the domestic regulation of every country. I think that also a very fair argument.
Thanks, Wang. Joining us today is also Cassia Odrosek, who is a project manager at the Mozilla Foundation, where she specifically looks at the Internet Health Report. And the Internet Health Report is a unique project. I think one of the few open source efforts led by the Mozilla Foundation to assess, as the report says, the health of the Internet. And I think it's unique in the sense that it's one of the few initiatives that take stock of what ordinary users think about the state of the internet today. So, whereas most punditry and most analytical reports that exist today on the internet and the state of the internet and how open it is and how secure it is tend to be top-down, driven by consulting firms or think tanks. And you, on the other hand, have sort of created this bottom-up report, which looks at how open, how safe the internet is. So, Cassia, I wanted to ask you one, given that you've just released your last month your report on the health of the internet, the 2019 report. What are some of the major conclusions that come from that report in terms of this effort that has taken us equally? Now, for instance, Dong and I were talking about the Chinese approach to the internet, but I would say today perhaps the most existential threat from creating differential regimes or perhaps clamping down on some of the core notions of how the internet is governed is coming equally from the West in certain parts of Western Europe and North America. How does, in all the years that you've been doing the health report, what is the state of the health of the internet in 2019? Do you feel that things are going to get better or worse from here? And specifically on the issue of this idea of the splinternet, I mean, are you really seeing geopolitical and economic forces pulling the internet apart in a, in a political and economic way?
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Just a clarification regarding the internet. People and how the internet influences their lives and the society, but we also work with research, we visualize research, stories, and we interview people who actually do something and lead projects that try to make internet what we describe as a healthier internet. Right. And we work with a framework of these 5 issues. Decentralization, digital inclusion, web literacy, private security, and of course openness, as you mentioned. Mozilla in general stands for internet, and everything we do, we follow the mission of the internet, keeping the internet open and accessible. Of course, it's not going to be a surprise when I say that the idea of splinternet is, in my opinion, and the movement I represent, a wrong one. I think we are now, as a global society and the separate countries, we're tempted by going to grabbing for like easy solutions. In shaping the future, we're taking a step back. And I think we need to ask ourselves which kind of internet and which kind of world we want to live in. The internet is becoming more and more our daily reality, whether we want to stay true to the principles of an open internet that in the first place enable the innovation and the freedom of expression that we've seen, but of course, at the same time, acknowledging the problems that came with the development, such as like harassment harassment, the hate speech, or of course the dominance of the Western based, mostly US big tech companies. But at the same time, taking this fast decisions of shutting down internet and separating geographically and splintering the internet might at the same time shift all the control over what regular people see and what they perceive as true to the state actors, to the government. And in my opinion, that's just unacceptable when we think about human and fundamental rights. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, one of the rights is the right to be informed, right to information. And I think that's one of the main principles we have obligation as civil society and in general to fight for. Otherwise, we might end up with an internet that is splittered, where the truth means different things in different countries, and I think we've seen over the course of history where that might lead. It's just a ground for propaganda, for conflict, and for what we see already happening, disinformation. So I think splitting the internet even more can even accelerate these problems. That's also something that we talk about in the internet, the internet shutdowns, so-called slowdowns, happening all around the world. There was in this year, in 2018, there was twice as many internet shutdowns in the world than 2 years ago. So the problem is getting worse. But as I said, the solutions that we're looking for, they shouldn't be too abrupt, and we should remember what were the founding principles for the internet and where should we be going, not only taking the decisions too fast and the easiest one that are out there. Also regarding the available software.
And I guess just to follow up on that, I think on the issue of internet shutdowns, because that sort of figures prominently in our debate on what the splinternet, the idea of the splinternet and how law enforcement agencies and regulatory agencies are clamping down on access to the internet and shutting down digital networks in a perceived moment of crisis. Right?
That's right.
Now, and I know that there is, for instance, this digital movement called Keep It On.
Right, Access Now, led by Access Now.
So there are clearly organizations that are invested in the idea of keeping the internet open and readily available or accessible to people throughout moments of crisis or emergencies. But, and I wanted to know whether you had a chance to speak with, say, constituencies from the developing world on this issue about shutdowns in the internet. Because if you speak to a law enforcement official in India or China, or, some of it is driven by helplessness. This knee-jerk reaction to shut down the internet is driven by helplessness to the extent that a law enforcement official who is faced with a potential crisis which involves human casualties or certainly violence of a scalable proportion, and violence that tends to spill over or at least gradually increase in its scale and intensity. The tendency to shut down the internet is really, like I said, a knee-jerk reaction, but the fear of the unknown. What would happen if we were to keep the internet open? So some of it is just a lack of awareness as to what you can and cannot do with the internet being open. But some of it is also some of it was also based on this reality that law enforcement agents have very limited tools available to them, thanks to a sort of complete disregard by big technology, these major technology companies who have invested very little in emerging markets, which are sort of the biggest sources of revenue and growth. But they very lately begun to invest in resources that can help law enforcement agencies get access to data, or perhaps sort of not resort to these sort of ham-handed measures like shutting down the internet. Have you seen some sort of progress in potential areas of collaboration between law enforcement agencies and big technology, or do you feel that we are still talking about shutdowns in the same way that we spoke about them 3 years ago, 4 years ago, where law enforcement agencies just have this blanket ban imposed, and there is and their writ runs large until the emergency sort of passes?
I think there was a development. That was something that we mentioned in the last report. But the development for the worse, so to say, I think that the law enforcement is getting even more sophisticated into we call it the slowdowns are the new shutdowns. So that shutdowns are not happening anymore that much because they are easier to the law enforcement, the governments are slowing down the speed of the internet to like a level where it takes 1 day to upload a picture to Twitter and so on. That also gives you an idea of why it's not always that they help us and they want to maybe middle of a terrorist attack. But at the same time, I think that also plays a role in shutting down voices that they don't want to. We don't want to be heard. Dissidents protest, and so on. And I think what you said, like, we need to think more about solutions. What can we do? And not go, as I mentioned, for the easy solution. Yeah, so just like shut down everything or slow down everything to make it easier, to make the life more difficult, both for the terrorists, but also for regular people. So we talk about interview done now, and she was giving examples of people who suffer really during crisis when the internet is shut down. And for example, and find out if the people are family, doctors, medical advice over WhatsApp and so on. So that's also something to be considered while you're shutting down the internet. Which value and which goods are kind of measuring higher, and as you said, thinking about different solutions because I'm sure they exist. Than shutting down the whole communication network.
Thanks. Let me now go to Mikhail Korostkov is from the Kommersant publishing house, which is one of the main publishing houses in Russia. And I'm sure you've fielded this question many times before in such public engagements. Russia too has sort of, there has been this regulatory impulse in Russia to localize the internet and to manage or perhaps even micromanage the governance of the internet with a view, as Wang mentioned, given the prevalent view that the governance of the internet has primarily been dominated by companies and organizations and governing institutions, all based in the Western Hemisphere. And Russia feels that this is neither equitable nor, reflective of ground realities in other societies. But I also know that there is today a thriving startup ecosystem in Russia, in some parts of Russia certainly. There are cybersecurity researchers. Some of the best cybersecurity researchers come from civilians based out of Russia. So Russia is clearly invested in the digital economy. We don't know the extent to which it is invested in the global digital economy, but it's certainly invested in the idea of using digital networks for the country's own development. How does it gel with the, how are ordinary Russians looking back and seeing these debates unfold about the splinternet, and how about some of the protectionist measures that have been imposed even by Europe or the United States about trade and e-commerce, and to some of the more sensitive debates on privacy and data protection, because the right to be forgotten debate. I mean, it has its origins in Russia. A unique proposal that came out of Russia, and not much is talked about as to why that debate happened. How are ordinary Russians thinking about and responding to this debate?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And I would like to first tell several things about the Russian internet. First and foremost, Russian internet has been historically absolutely free from any restrictions, I would say, till 2014. It was the original deal that Russian internet has become one of the major engines of the non-oil resource economy of Russia. We're one of the very few countries in the world that originally had its own search engine, Yandex, not Google, that had its own social network, Contact, that had its own antivirus, Kaspersky, and all these services. And what is more important is that it is not that we built all these companies within a closed environment protected from any competition. They were built within a system of market competition. So, and they won in this competition. So since 2012-2014, the government tries to somehow manage the internet and tries to establish a system that, by many experts, seen as the small copy of what we see in China right now, like this golden shield stuff. But here we see a very interesting case when the government struggles to impose even the smallest amount of regulations because the system as a whole was developing as an absolutely free since the very beginning, since 1990s, since 1997, since 1995. And right now, all the efforts that are done by Russian officials, for example, to block certain websites or to block the whole systems, they end in complete failure. The biggest example is the blockade of Telegram.
Right.
It's the messenger that was developed by Pavel Durov, one of our, not our anymore because he changed the citizenship, but we still perceive him as one of our genius of industry. They tried to block Telegram, but they failed to the extent that most of government institutions and government officials, they still continue to have Telegram channels. So they cannot execute their own law and they don't even pretend that it's being executed.
Right.
Right now, just in May, at the beginning of May 2019, they finally adopted a very disturbing law that is very badly perceived by the Russian community. It's called, I don't remember the name, it's actually quite long, but people call it the Law on Sovereign Internet, which basically says that, of course, guys, we want an open and free internet in Russia, we want it to be connected to the world, but you see, there is an objective truth that in the United States, there was recently adopted a new security strategy where Russia and China are named as two biggest enemies. So we need to react on that, and exactly because internet is such an important part of life of ordinary Russian citizens, of Russian businesses, then we must create a system that will be able to sustain Russian internet even if it will be switched off by the Americans.
Actually, I wanted to talk to you about this because the point that you raise, which is that the Russian internet is such a crucial life of ordinary Russians and Russian businesses. I don't think a lot of people see this outside. I wanted to ask you whether the Russian elites, the people who run these businesses, as well as the folks at the Kremlin or the government agencies, have they sort of struggled at the narrative game? To give you an example, Kaspersky or Yandex, for instance, are routinely cited in the Western press as being collaborators with the FSB or the Russian government agencies. They're in Silicon Valley, it's the same thing. The Silicon Valley companies also collaborate with the CIA or the FBI in the development of products, in the conception and execution of these platforms, and to more nefarious purposes. The Russians are doing nothing different. But somehow we hear more about the Russians and so I just wanted to ask you whether there has been this narrative game that the Russians have played it quite badly.
Well, you're absolutely correct, but this is one side of the story, I would say. Of course, as you absolutely correct, tech companies are cooperating with the authorities in every country, and but there are different sorts of cooperation. One thing is when we have a terrorist act, like we had in New Zealand, and the videos, these violent videos, they're being distributed all over media, and then like the government is trying to shut down it to prevent the issue from reoccurring. But another thing that, for example, there was a news today, like an hour ago, when I started listening to the first panel, that Yandex agreed to give the decipher decryption keys to Russian secret services. This is a little bit disturbing thing because to my mind, there is a very big difference between. This is the debate that we all should have actually, where your privacy ends and where the interest of the society as a whole begins. Right. So the balance, it is pretty hard to find the balance, but I personally, observing the development of the internet and the discussion about this within Russia, I personally made my choice that I would better prefer to have privacy than the security, because if you start giving the state like these tiny bits of privacy, you finally find yourself in a situation when you have none of it, and you have neither privacy nor security, as Churchill said. And I can give you an example. Facebook was generally not very popular in Russia because everybody was using Vkontakte. It's a nice network, and I still think that from the technological point of view, it's better than Facebook. But people started actively migrating to Facebook when when Vkontakte was bought by the structures close to the Russian government, because people cannot be sure that their privacy is properly protected. So even if you don't care about some political freedoms and stuff like that, you're just losing money because people want their privacy to be protected. And I think people in the European Union and the United States, when they're conducting these debates, they have never faced a real threat of all their privacy being taken out. That's why they're really viewing possibilities like let's shut down the internet, let's give government all our keys. That's when I see these debates from inside Russia, I feel like it's not going to end well.
No, I'm glad you brought that up because I think the extent to which privacy has been integrated into business models in Russia is seriously understudied. You're right in that the state, as with any other state, and the Russian state is perhaps more invasive than other states. But like any other state, the Russian government wants the keys to the kingdom. But what has been neglected in this debate is the extent to which security has been built in. I think it's no coincidence that Pavel Durov comes from Russia. A telegram came from Russia. I think, but hopefully, I think the Russian government too will realize that there is a viable business economic proposition there to invest in privacy business models and take it to the rest of the world. But in closing, let me ask each of you for your inputs on what you think is. You could refer to an incident, or you could refer to a development, specifically either in the jurisdictions that you attend to as scholars, or whether it is your own jurisdiction that you live and work in. What is the single most pernicious development, or at least the most dangerous development that threatens to make the splinternet a reality? And splinternet could be a technical way of looking at, internet shutdowns, or it could also be creating different internets for different communities. What do you think, and I'll start with Wong. What do you think is perhaps the most dangerous development that is pushing us towards the splinter?
Well, before getting to that, I actually also wanted to just get back to the privacy issue. I think this is an issue. I think sometimes the Western sort of narrative, really sort of gets miss about, which is there's growing concern about privacy coming from the consumer part in China as well. So don't assume that privacy or the government is not protecting people's privacy. I think that would be a wrong assumption to begin with. To be very honest, I think the reality where we are facing is a challenging one. As the key phrase you just mentioned, splinternet, whether or not we are entering into a world where the internet will be divided into two. But, frankly, I think this is a part of a broader trend we are facing now, because internet is part of that. What is happening is I don't think we would have time to go into this discussion about so-called a new Cold War unfolding between China and the United States. So, and 5G is another very important part of that. And I think I'm going to be talking about in the dinner session tonight. So everything, this is just I think we also have to put this into the broader, sort of bring into the picture, which is the great power competition, particularly between rising power and dominant power, China, United States. If we do not sort of figure that question out, internet, we will never be able to resolve the debate surrounding internet, because internet is part of that great power competition.
So the new Cold War between the US and China as the major development. Cassia?
I'll just add also towards the privacy issue. Personally, I don't think we need to whether make these extreme choices between privacy or security. I think there might be some middle way in between. There might be, of course, cases and situations where the state has to intervene, but we need to do it within a system of law and with procedures and safeguards that are transparent, which nowadays is not always the case in authoritarian regimes. So that's on this side. Whether the development, I was thinking about two things. One is definitely the violence and the online harassment that is accelerating. That's always been there in our societies. The problems was always this, but technology accelerated it to a much bigger scale. And that also incentivized this thinking about splitting internet, of creating special like closed communities with their own rules, separating ourselves, which then again can then create like filter bubbles and so on. And we can end up with an even bigger problem, more susceptible to propagandas and so on. So I think this is an issue that we need to tackle. And the other one is the dominance of the big tech companies, of course, is leading to this backlash, where there's China always had the Great Firewall, but Russia is also kind of responding to it. In Europe, we're responding to it also as well about this data sovereignty, and we want to have innovation in the technology also happen on the European grants and so on. So I think we also need to look at this centralization that happened there, and there's talk about like breaking up monopolies and so on. There are different solutions being proposed. So I think this is also one of the root causes, together with the harassment, that would be one of the biggest issues to tackle.
I like the way that you phrase it. I think perhaps I would call it the gentrification of the internet. It's like, where what you're seeing in many communities as they urbanize and they develop is that certain sections tend to invest more heavily in the security of their gated communities, because especially, and gentrification happens in neighborhoods that were once considered unsafe or particularly prone to violence. And you're absolutely right. I think that's a trend that perhaps we will see in the internet as well. Mikhail?
If we're speaking about like the most important and the most disturbing trends, I would name two of them. The first one is an inclination that is now on the rise to see the internet as something that is used not by individuals but by states, and making the state the main player here, which is to my mind is the sign that internet has really become the linchpin of our lives. Because when it was small and there was just some guys exchanging photos and selling some small stuff to each other, nobody cared. And now we have an internet that is basically the basis for many businesses and many communities, and that's why the state wants to change it somehow. But but it's an interesting point of discussion, because the very reason that internet has become the thing that it is now is because it was driven by individuals and by companies, not by the states. So by trying to make the thing better, they are risking to destroy it, to my mind. And the second thing is what I find really disturbing, is that people nowadays, especially in the West, are blaming the internet for the bad things that are happening to us. People think that the spread of terrorism is because the internet helps to spread terrorism. No, it's not, definitely. The fact that ISIS actively used internet to promote their views made some people think that it contributed to the rise of ISIS, while there are several serious scholars who I read who proved that it is exactly because ISIS was so explicit by publishing all its atrocities in the internet, it helped to galvanize a coalition against ISIS. So internet is not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a tool. It's just like any other tool, like a fork. You can kill a person with a fork, but it doesn't mean that the forks are bad and we must manage them or do something to them. That's the two trends.
I think you shouldn't. I mean, compare it to just a fork. It's a pretty powerful fork, I suppose. But your point that it is a tool, it is a tool, and governments and regulators should approach it as a tool rather than the instrument that was responsible, say, for the rise of ISIS, or there are certain geopolitical factors, certain political factors that are well beyond the remit of the internet.
Actually, it's the usually when something bad happens like ISIS, it's usually the failure of the politicians, and they want to relocate their failure on somebody and they usually choose the internet as a target.
Right, which is a point well taken. But I want to thank you for all three of you for taking some time off to discuss this. I hope you will have many more of these conversations and to get to interact with the audience, especially our colleagues from Africa and Asia who have come here to bring some of those perspectives and to engage with them in a substantive way. That is the idea behind curating this conversation in Africa, and to bring a group of scholars and users, ordinary users of the internet from the developing parts of the world. But thank you for your time and hope you have a good, productive 48 hours ahead of you.